Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to share with you some of my favorite books that I read in 2020. So I thought we would start with the nonfiction ones because that is primarily what I actually read in 2020. But then I'm also going to show you a couple of the fiction books that I really enjoyed as well. So jumping right in, and these are in no particular order, I just have a stack next to me and I'm just going to grab them and we're going to talk about each one briefly. One of the books that I really enjoyed this year was The Maiden Mother Crone by DJ Conway. And this is The Myth and Reality of the Triple Goddess. So I have been doing a lot of goddess study over the last few years. And you can see I have highlighted in this book quite a bit. And I found this book to be really quite interesting, and there was a lot of different information in it as far as learning about the different aspects of the goddess in terms of Maiden, Mother, and Crone. In part one, we have the mythology, where they talk about the three faces of the goddess and the importance of myth. Then we go into the Maiden, the Mother, and the Crone, and then some of the other sacred threes, such as the Fates, the Muses, the Valkyries, and then we have information about the Sacred Three today. Now, it is important to note that this book is a little bit older. So this was originally published in 1994, and this particular edition is the 5th printing from 1999. So it is a little bit older, but I wouldn't say that it's dated, because I think for the most part the information still applies today. I really enjoyed looking at the different archetypes. One of the other things that I also really enjoyed is that they go into different aspects. So here in the Crone, we talk about different goddesses that represent that Crone archetype, which I thought was really interesting. We have the same for the Maiden and the Mother, and it talks about each in detail. And I found this to be really interesting. I do like the little illustrations that are throughout. They're really nice. Very beautifully illustrated little book. Just some little really simple black and white images, but I think they really do add to the overall aesthetic of the book. These, you can recognize some of them. I'm pretty sure that's on one of the Goddess Oracle cards or something similar. But see, beautiful illustrations. So this is one that I definitely enjoyed to kind of help me just dive deeper into not only just my goddess study, but just in kind of that divine feminine aspect as a whole. So I thought that was really a wonderful book, and I really enjoyed reading it. So definitely one of my favorites for 2020. So moving along, another book that I really enjoyed in 2020 was The Psychic Witch, and this is by Matt Urin. Hopefully I pronounced that right. It is a metaphysical guide to meditation, magic, and manifestation. And I do believe that I have talked about probably most of these books at various points on my channel, probably in some depthier videos or perhaps in just some of my monthly reflections videos, because these have been fairly important books in my practice throughout the year of 2020. And so I really did enjoy reading this book. It is kind of geared to be more towards a beginner. Unfortunately, my book, see how it's all bent? I don't know if you can see that. My book actually came bent from Amazon, but I just left it because, I don't know, it didn't really bother me a whole lot, but probably doesn't look real great having it on camera. I know I've talked about this book before because I think I showed it in a video, but we have really the whole point about this book is that it talks about manifesting magic from within. So it's not about the tools or all the different kind of extra external elements. It is really focused on creating magic from within, and I really enjoy that because that is kind of the primary focus of my own personal practice. So we have some information about, reality is energy, brainwave states, affirmations, and neuroplasticity, which I thought was interesting. So we have some meditations, things for tuning in. We have things like extrasensory perception, purification and shielding, and then we go into different type of energies and elemental forces. There's also a whole list of exercises, which I found really helpful to be able to just, you know, turn right to those exercises that you wanted to do. So this is a really wonderful written book, and it's got a lot of really interesting information. Like there's some of those illustrations. I really like the touches of illustration in this book too. Right here you see he's talking about the different levels of self, which is really interesting. You can see that I have highlighted because I am a highlighter, and that's definitely something I do in my books. So there were a couple of mentions that Matt had written in this book that I really did want to point out, and I highlighted them because they were things that I definitely wanted to remember. Here he says, "From where I am in my path, it appears to me that mastery is not so much about reaching a specific end goal, but instead about seeing how deep you can take practice and striving to better your experience with it." I think that really sums up this book, because while it is definitely focused on some kind of more beginner practices, I think that it really does encourage you to kind of go back to that beginning point and to really dive deeper into them, and I am all about that. So I really enjoyed that aspect of this particular book, and it's definitely been one that I've dipped in and out of throughout the year. So another book that I really enjoyed in 2020 is Avalon Within, A Sacred Journey of Myth, Mystery, and Inner Wisdom. Now this particular book you'll see looks brand new, and that's because I originally purchased this and read it on Kindle, but I really wanted a hard copy of it, and it has some beautiful photos in here, which you don't get access to in the Kindle version, so I really wanted to have access to those as well, because there are places that I feel that they reference in the book that relate to these photos, and so I really wanted to be able to have them. This was a wonderful book, and one that I'm definitely dipping in and out of and will continue to work through, because this is kind of tied into my own personal practice. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but let's just take a look here at what's inside. So it talks about the 5 seeds of wisdom, which is, and that kind of ties into the Avalonian cycle of healing, which is really what this book is about. So we go into the different cycles. We have entering the cauldron, the otherworldly journey, where he talks about the path of history and the path of legend. We have the power of cycles, which was really interesting, because that's definitely ties into kind of what I always talk about with that seasonal kind of cycle nature of things. I think that was really key for me. And then we have the different stations, which are kind of the different stages of growth, or the stages on that cycle. So we have descent, confrontation, emergence, resolution, and integration. And those are really kind of the heart of the book, is really tapping into those different 5 stages of development or healing, or however you choose to approach it. So we also have a couple of different sections on the pilgrimage of spirit, the mirror of self, and the goddesses of Avalon, which is always interesting, and connecting with the lady of the land. Now this author also has another book out called something to do with the moons, mythic moons of Avalon, I think, which is on my reading list for 2021. We definitely have some little illustrations in this book as well, but this one is really about it's kind of a step-by-step guide, in a sense, to walking that path, those 5 stages. I'm going to see if I can find the so here we go, the Avalonian cycle of healing. So it kind of takes you through this whole process, or the station of descent, the station of confrontation, the station of emergence, resolution, and integration. And the whole point is to kind of continually go through them again and again. And we think about in terms of like a labyrinth. And that's really the focus of this book. I read this book, or have read this book, more than once. And I dip in and out of it depending on kind of where I am in my personal practice. And so it's been really handy for that. I've been doing it on the Kindle, but it's kind of a bit easier to dip in and out of a paperback book. So I really wanted to get it in hard copy as well, just so that I could do that kind of dipping in and out of what I'm working on. I do like that we also have journaling questions, so journaling prompts, which I always really enjoy. So that one's been kind of almost more of like a workbook for me. And it's one that I've been using all throughout the year and will definitely be using moving into the next year as well. So another book that kind of ties into that sort of divine feminine or kind of that spiritual practice is Mysteries of the Dark Moon, The Healing Power of the Dark Goddess by Demetra George. This is a book just chock full of information, and it was a little bit of a slower read for me, and not because it was like difficult or anything. You can see I highlighted a lot in it as well, but it's just so full of information. There's so much in here that it kind of like you have to take it in chunks just to be able to kind of digest it all. I also love this book also includes journal questions, which is really helpful. So let's kind of take a look at what this book entails. So here we have our contents. So we have Revisioning the Dark, where she talks about the dark moon, the dark goddess, the lunar, her story of the feminine. So in part 2, she talks about the different goddesses of the dark moon, and part 3 is kind of like the sort of working with those goddesses and the dark moon energies. And so you can see like this is pretty substantial. It definitely goes through the phases of the moon, and we have all kinds of different associations. We have different time periods, how things have evolved, how they've changed. There's a really, here's information about the 8 lunation phases. And in the beginning, there's a really interesting section on, or really a whole chapter on, if I can get to the beginning of it, on the sort of evolution of the dark goddess. So she talks a lot about the history and how things have evolved and changed over the lifespan of humanity, which I thought was really interesting. And of course we have information about the different dark goddesses. So here she has, information about Hecate, which is wonderful. I really enjoyed that. That was key reason why I bought this particular book, to kind of coincide with my personal Hecate practice. But I really found that it was really interesting because it went into a lot of other information too. But you can see that there's quite a bit of information for every goddess. Like we're going on 4 or 5 pages here just on Hecate. So that was really interesting. But yeah, it's really detailed, it's really in depth, and it is just chock full of information. Definitely a slower read for me, and I have a whole notebook full of notes from this particular book. So it was very informative and had a lot of really wonderful information that I hope to incorporate into my own work with the dark moon. So you might remember that over the summer I did the Boho Rune Study group with Lisa and a bunch of other people on our Facebook, and then we did a couple of live chats on Lisa's channel, and that was a lot of fun, and I accumulated quite a few books on runes during that time, but this one is really the one that has kind of stood out to be I don't want to say the best, but the most helpful of all of the rune books that I have. And this one is the one that I keep finding myself going back to as I'm continuing my rune studies. And this is Taking Up the Runes, A Complete Guide to Using Runes in Spells, Ritual, Divination, and Magic by Diana L. Paxson. And so I think that because this goes beyond just that sort of introductory information, I think that's why I tend to be dipping in and out of it a little bit more. But it also does have all of that initial introductory information where it goes through each of the runes. And one of the things that I really like about this book is that it goes through the runes in pairs. So you can see how they match up with each other, which is really interesting. And then we have rituals for the runes. So it really allows you to kind of dig deep into working with the runes. So in each, for each rune, we have, a little bit of information about it. These quick little messages here, those have been really key to my own personal work with the runes. So we have the ancient meaning on each rune, which usually goes on for a couple pages, which is really interesting. The modern meaning, which I think is really important. And then we have information about interpreting and working with the rune. And then this book is set up to be like a kind of study group in itself. So then we have different aspects for studying and experiencing the rune, which is really interesting. So I really like that. This whole portion of the book is really about all the runes, right? Just all, what, 20, is there 24? 24 runes, I think. So a lot of information to help you really get started. So I think like the first whole part of the book is like that sort of beginners, not really beginners, but because it definitely goes deeper than that, but that sort of initial base understanding of each of the runes. And then we get kind of into more of actually working with the runes in a divinatory sense. There is rune spells. So here we're going into like all kinds of your sacred space, meditations. The back of the book is kind of almost like a rune grimoire. So we have spells, we have meditations, we have songs, like all kinds of interesting stuff in relation to each of the runes, which I think is really cool. So it kind of like takes you to that next level with your rune work, which I thought was really interesting. So this has definitely been the rune book that I have really worked in the most, and the one that I've continued to use even after we kind of finished our initial study of the runes in the group. So this is the one that I'm continuing to work with, and definitely the one that I think I recommend the most out of all the rune books that I currently have. So the last book that I want to share that I used sort of in my practices is the Witch's Herbal Apothecary. And this one I know for a fact I've shown before on my channel, but this one takes a seasonal approach. And if you have heard me talk about my own personal practice, you may remember me mentioning that my own practice is very seasonally based. And so for me, this is just spot on. And it really kind of ties into my own personal practice quite well. So we have kind of about, weaving yourself back into the great web. So like, what is a witch and things like that. And then we have the 4 chapters on the seasonal associations. So these are each of the, the rebirth and awakening in spring, the ripen and thrive in summer, the harvest and compost in fall, and the release and rest in winter. And then we have in the end, the chapter on great healing. So the fact that this book goes through everything seasonally is just really wonderful. It's kind of, the paper's a little bit shiny, so hopefully that won't pick up too much glare. Let's see here if we can find. Okay, so here we have one of the seasonal sections, and here we have Earth Magic and the Medicine of Spring. We have a sort of correspondence sheet, almost like in the beginning. This is almost like a seasonal grimoire in its own self, which is really cool. We have a little poem here, and then we have information about the seasonal energies. So for spring is rebirth, to regenerate yourself, and it's this kind of the energy of the expansive maiden. We have entering the portal of the east, because east is associated with spring in this book. And we have a kind of meditation for entering the east each morning. Some different practices that you could possibly do to tune into that energy. We have some information on herbs, spring nourishment and cleansing. Throughout this book, there are different sort of healing rituals that you can do. Here's a spring cleaning one. Here's setting our intentions, birthing a new life, and renewing ourselves. And then each of them also talks about the different archetypes that relate to it. This is the Maiden, Mother, Crone. So spring is the Maiden. and the earth medicine is wild weeds. And then we have a whole section on recipes and medicine making that relate to that particular season. So we have, like, it is actually a recipe book in this section. So we have some on flower essences and in the garden. Talking about permaculture and regenerative farming practices, pollination, guerrilla gardening. I mean, this is just full of seasonal related information. Here's a bunch of spring rituals and some herbs that you might want to use in the spring. And it's like a little like grimoire page for each of them. So really interesting. Now we move into summer. So the whole book is pretty much set up that way, where it's like, this has kind of become like my sort of seasonal grimoire in itself, although I am working on like kind of a personal version for myself. But as I'm working my way through that, and as I'm still building that, so to speak, or creating that, this is the book that I've been turning to pretty regularly throughout the year, just to tune into those seasonal energies, to pull recipes or rituals. And it's been like really amazing to work in this book. It's a beautiful book. It's beautifully written. It's beautifully put together. And it's definitely, like, I think of all the books that I've read this year, this is definitely the one that I've used the most, and probably my favorite of all of them. While I read a lot more books, nonfiction books in 2020, these were kind of some of the standout titles that I either kept referring back to. Actually, I think in most of these cases, they are books that I not only did I read, but I have continued to use throughout 2020. So we have The Witches, Herbal, Apothecary, The Taking of the Runes, The Mysteries of the Dark Moon, Avalon Within, Psychic Witch. And these ones I have all come back to repeatedly throughout the year. So they're not just like books that I read once and just shove up on a shelf. These are books that I keep out because I continually dive into them throughout. And of course, we did talk about the Maiden Mother Crone book, which it kind of serves as more of a reference book for me. So I don't get into it as much as I do these other books, but it's definitely one that had some really great information, and I definitely do get back into it, but it's one that I really enjoyed reading. So before we move on to the fiction books, I do just want to make one special mention for a book that has been really special to me this year, and that is the SelfWorth Path, A Guided Journey to an Empowered Life by my very dear friend Lisa Pepez. And this book is not only really special to me because it is a fantastic book, and I love Lisa's approach to sort of walking your own self-worth path, as the title states. But for this particular book, I was very honored to be able to help Lisa bring this book into being. And so I helped her put the print edition together that we see here, and of course the ebook edition as well. And so it was just a pleasure to work with Lisa to help her kind of bring her dream into the world. And it was so much fun to be able to be a part of that. And I really enjoyed being able to work with her to be able to put this together. And so this book definitely has a really special place in my heart, and I just wouldn't feel right about not mentioning it in this video, because it has been a book that has been very special to me throughout 2020. You know, not just because it was a fun project to put together and that I really enjoyed working with my dear friend, also because it's a really wonderful book in terms of actually like walking your path, right? And as she says, it's a guided journey to an empowered life. There are wonderful activities, wonderful steps. I've gone through this book kind of beginning to end, and of course I have jumped in and out of it as well. So I've definitely found it to be one that I have been returning to again and again, just because the information that Lisa has in here has been really powerful through her book. She really encourages you to really embrace who you are And that's kind of really what I'm all about, and what I'm really trying to do in my own life is just really embrace my own authentic self. And this book has really been very helpful for that, because while I've kind of been focused more on the embrace my authentic self on more of a sort of kind of spiritual level, this book has really helped me to kind of realize that I do need to incorporate the mundane level into things too, right? Like to embrace my inner and my outer self. And this book really has been fundamental for that. So I definitely wanted to give it a shout out, but I really kind of wanted it to have its own little special place. So again, that's the SelfWorth Path, A Guided Journey to an Empowered Life by Lisa Pepez. And real quick, I thought it would be fun to go through a couple of the fiction titles that I really enjoyed this year. First and foremost would be these books by Joanne Harris. I think I have about all of her books. I love her books. I love her writing. This was The Strawberry Thief is a continuation in the series that did inspire the movie Chocolat. So that whole series, I think this is the 4th book now. And if you watch the movie, like if you haven't read the books and you've just seen the movie, you may not know that it's quite as witchy as it actually is in the book. But that one was a really great read, because of course I've read all the previous ones, so I'm really excited to read that one. There's a little bit of some personal information in the back where she talks about writing this whole series and everything, and that was really interesting as well. And then I found this one that I actually saw on Mad Witch's channel. So Giselle at Mad Witch had talked about this one, which is A Pocket Full of Crows, and this I think was, I guess, one of her earlier books that she had written, and then it was just released, or one of her earlier works, I guess, that maybe was written and released. And this one is like a little fairy tale, but it's more like kind of old school fairy tale, as in it's not a Disney fairy tale. I was just gonna look. I do like that it goes through the kind of seasons. I guess it was published in 2017, so it is a little bit older, but I hadn't heard of it. I hadn't seen it since until Giselle mentioned it. Look at the beautiful cover pages. It is a hardback book, which is nice. I was trying to find, it has little illustrations within it, which are really pretty. So there's one. But it's definitely like a witchy fairy tale, and that one was a really quick read, but I really enjoyed it. And since she's one of my favorite authors, I was super excited to find another book that she had written. So another fiction series that I read really towards the beginning of the year is the Queen of Hearts, or the Wonderland series from Colleen Oakes. And this is actually a young adult trilogy, but it's really good. It's all about, not necessarily the Alice in Wonderland stories, but it takes place in that same world, and it is about the Queen of Hearts herself. And so there are 3 books. I believe this is the order of them. It starts with the Queen of Hearts, goes to the Blood of Wonderland, and War of the Cards. These were, again, really quick and easy reads, but if you like the whole Wonderland world and kind of looking at the other side of the story, this is a really interesting series. It was a really fun read. So another fiction book that I read that I know I mentioned during all the rune studies is Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, and this is a retelling of the Norse mythology stories, and it's just like written in this kind of almost bedtime story type of manner, but it's really an quick and easy read. The stories were easily digestible, I guess is really what I'm trying to say. But it's just fantastic. His writing is wonderful. I've read a couple of his other books too, but it really takes the stories, the Norse mythology, and kind of puts it more in layman's terms and puts it in more of a modern sense. So even though we're looking at, really old mythology, it's rewritten in a way that it kind of connects more in our modern world, in our modern language, I guess is really what I'm trying to get at. And so it made it actually easier to understand and easier to read. So that one I definitely enjoyed. I've heard that the audiobook is amazing, because I've heard him reading it is amazing, but I haven't gotten that yet. So the last fiction book that I wanted to talk about is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is again another fairy tale type novel, and definitely again in that sort of witchy sense, but we're in this sort of enchanted land, and it's about, well, I'm not going to really tell you because then I'll spoil it, but it's really beautifully written, and I really enjoyed reading it. It's a really interesting story. It's like a modern fairy tale, right? But it's not modern. It takes place in a magical, mythical world, but it's a fairy tale for a new age type of thing. And it was really well written. She has another book that I think it just came out, that I did also get, and that's on my list to read in 2021. But this was the first book that I've read by her, and she's a phenomenal writer, so I'm definitely going to be reading more for sure. So that's just some of the kind of notable fiction titles that I read in 2020. There were, of course, more, but these were the ones that really kind of stood out as being, really great books, and books that I might even read again. And for me, reading a fiction book again, that's always telling. There are very few books that I actually read again besides kind of like the classics, because I do like to read like Pride and Prejudice every year, and like Jane Eyre and things like that. So these were all in that kind of remarkable reads that I really enjoyed. So that was a look at some of the nonfiction and fiction books that were my favorite in 2020. I, of course, read a lot of other things, but these were the ones that really stood out for me. And I just wanted to kind of do a little update on the books that I've been reading throughout the year. I'd love to know what you read and what you enjoyed, so feel free to leave it in the comments below. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.